Okay, welcome everybody. This is ProSocial World's research seminar series. I'm Beth Hawkins with ProSocial World, the research director, and I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, Mitch Distin. So Dr. Distin's interest lies in the intersection of evolutionary science and indigenous spirituality. He has a PhD in ecology, evolutionary biology, and biodiversity from the University of Valencia in Spain. A Master of Science in the history and philosophy of science, and a BS in neuroscience. Mitch wrote his PhD thesis on the intersection of evolvability and multi-level selection from a historico-philosophical perspective. He's currently in the process of writing a pop sci book on the social and spiritual implications of multi-level selection theory. And his thesis won several awards and has since been turned into a free ebook available on ResearchGate. Little plug for Mitch.
Cheers, lady.
And he's also interested in taking a lead role in forming a new community within the ProSocial World Commons on a nature or scientific based spirituality, which we all think is a fabulous idea. And let us know if you're interested in being involved, specifically Dunya and Mitch. So without further ado, please, Mitch, if you'd like to share your screen and
Yeah, sounds
your
good.
brilliance.
Sounds good. Let me just try to get this one more time. Okay, how's that look?
Perfect.
That's good.
Good. I just gotta switch this around here to put it on my big screen. Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you and welcome, bienvenidos. As you very well put, thank you for my introduction there, Beth. Mitchell Ryan Distin, otherwise known as Mitch de Michigan in España. And it's a true pleasure to be speaking in front of all you today. I'm very new to the pro-social community, but I'd like to become a more active member, most certainly. And what's kind of funny about the situation though is that I've somewhat jokingly referred to myself as Wilson's Labrador over in Europe a few times, which is kind of a nod to Thomas Huxley being referred to as Darwin's Bulldog, mostly because I do try to champion MLS theory over in Europe. But my friends don't think I'm so much of a bulldog. I'm a little bit more cute and cuddly, like a Labrador. So, yeah, that's. But with this being said, I do diverge with David on several issues of merit that I will hopefully get into today. One being that I don't think MLS was a tenable theory until the past 10 to 20 years, when we started to finally look at evolutionary dynamics over longer timescales and given more frequent spatial changes. And also from personal conversations I've had with a lot of evolutionary biologists, especially evolutionary ecologists, I believe most evolutionary biologists see MLS theory as theoretically possible. They don't largely due to your work though, David. But they do not see they don't see it as entirely empirically sufficient enough to refer it to as a theory yet. So my initial aim when I started, researching 10 long years ago, after my graduation from MSU, was to create the best available argument for MLS theory using what I see as the best empirical example of higher level selection at play, which is evolvability. So that's what I'll hopefully get into at this first part of this presentation. And so, yeah, for the last decade, I've been traveling around the world while concomitantly finishing my schooling. So I started at Michigan State University, went on to UCL, did my PhD at the Universidad de Valencia, and then I worked for a little bit at Cambridge. And then while I was finishing my doctorate, actually, I was traveling almost full time. And that's why I chose HPS as my, discipline because it allowed me to travel at the exact same moment. So through my travels, I lived with several indigenous communities in Mexico, Guatemala, Egypt, and I hope to go live in Peru this winter. But I became struck with how much convergence and synchronicity there seemed to be between what I was studying in evolutionary biology, more specifically MLS theory, and indigenous attitudes. So I'm excited to show you that today. So for the first half of this presentation, I'm going to go through my recent ebook, Evolution in Space and Time, the second synthesis of ecology, evolutionary biology, and the philosophy of biology, which marks the culmination of my last 10 years of historical, philosophical, and scientific research and attempts to tell the story of what's really been going on within biology over the past century. And so why did I organize my book in this way? Well, I believe the history of science suggests that there are three necessary elements to achieve theoretical progress in biology. I believe the first element needed is an accurate historiography that correctly identifies the problem. Second is abundant and sufficient evidence in support of the new view. And the third is a pragmatic solution to solving the problem. And I believe every failed program from the history of biology, such as orthogenesis, Lamarckism, or Wynne-Edwards group selection theory, lacked in either one or more of these elements. And I believe the EES today actually lacks in all three. So the aim of my book when I set out was to achieve all three necessary elements of progress by being an empirically sufficient and scientifically informed philosophical reconstruction of natural selection theory. So to begin our journey, we have to start by understanding the intellectual environment that really incubated early evolutionary theory. And this intellectual environment, the defining scientific philosophy for most of the 20th century, is known as logical positivism, what some may claim to be the first philosophy of science. Positivists such as Otto Neurath, Rudolf Carnap, Carl Hempel, etc., were particularly impressed with the logic and mathematics and technological success of late 19th century and early 20th century theoretical physics, which was back then, of course, the paragon for the other sciences to follow. They started a tradition known as the Unity of Science movement, which in its most egregious form held that all scientific terminology, laws, and theories should be reducible to physics in the long run. However, in its weaker form, the movement to unify the sciences approached scientific phenomena using explanatory strategy known as explanatory monism or reductionism, which is the favoring of one type of explanation, which is monism, or one fundamental level of explanation from which others can be derived or reducible to, which is reductionism, what was often the result of emergent phenomena being reducible to lower level events. This is a brilliant book that kind of goes into a little bit more depth on this by Sandra Mitchell. I'm sorry that these pictures didn't quite come out the way that I would have hoped, but it's called Biological Complexity and Integrative Pluralism. So I highly recommend reading that book. And so early biological methodology was fashioned after physics because this is just how everybody thought we should do science. Before an era that we conventionally know as the modern synthesis, most historians refer to it as a modern synthesis, between the periods of, or the dates of 1918 and 1956, biology was largely seen as a second science and an inferior science. There are many competing theories of adaptation, not just natural selection theory, but also orthogenetic theory and Lamarckism. And we had a divided biology. Most of the subdisciplines of biology weren't really under one coherent theoretical framework at this time. After the modern synthesis, evolutionary biology and biology more generally became seen as respectable scientific disciplines. There was a universal acceptance of natural selection theory amongst biologists, and biological knowledge became integrated into a coherent theoretical framework that brought together all the previously divided subdisciplines of biology into under one conceptual theoretical framework. And so, what really caused all these significant changes to occur during this era? Well, primarily the adoption of a robust mathematical program that quantified evolution, otherwise known as population genetics, lent evolutionary biology a new legitimacy within the broader intellectual zeitgeist of logical positivism. A new biological methodology was to be fashioned after the acceptable sciences of Newtonian physics and chemistry, while also allowing biology to preserve its autonomy from these sciences. All three of the founders of population genetics, R.A. Fisher, Sewell Wright, and J.B.S. Haldane, were attempting to bring biology on par with the physical sciences and drew explicit exemplars from these exact and rigorous sciences. And this was how the population geneticists modeled evolutionary change at a population level, with the four causal forces of selection, mutation, migration, and drift acting on individuals within a population to cause evolutionary change. And this was how I was originally taught evolution at university, and many still do teach this today. However, there are numerous issues with teaching evolution this way, especially when it comes to causation. Most prominently because all these causal forces don't act independently of one another, it's a lot more nuanced of a causal model than what population genetics typically allows for. So I'm not going to go into broad depth here. We can come back to this in discussion if we want, but most prominently, I want to notice mutation down here. Much or most de novo mutation and standing variation are likely modified or maintained by natural selection. So what we actually need is more of a reciprocal causal model of natural selection, because natural selection can actually act on mutation modifiers and then thereby increasing its own causal efficacy. So yeah, I believe this is why we need to move away from a traditionally mathematical model of natural selection to view natural selection in terms of ecology. Because only with a greater appreciation of the selective pressures causing natural selection can we understand why natural selection operates in a certain way as a causal theory. And so the big main reason why we can't use the same explanatory strategies as physics is due to the messy causation inherent in every biological system. Most biological phenomena are variable in space and time, and the causal effects of biological traits are nearly always multifactorial. They ensue at multiple levels of biological organization with upwards and downwards causation, and they all come with a complex evolutionary back history that was likely instantiated by every evolutionary process. Add on to this the fact that organisms can influence their environment and vice versa, which is known as reciprocal causation. Yet, most importantly, we also have to consider the capriciousness of ecological variables, as I will discuss in greater detail here in the following. Thus, the messiness of biological causation is precisely the reason why we cannot fashion biological methodology after physics, or why we cannot use the same theoretical and explanatory strategies to explain our causally complex phenomena. Which leads to the fundamental idea of evolution, the idea of change. Evolution is about biological change over time. It is a surprising historical fact that for the majority of evolutionary research, we have rarely studied how evolution typically unfolds in nature, in changing ecological environments over space and time. And I actually modeled this claim off of this quote taken from the father of ecological genetics, E.B. Ford, who noted how rarely we studied evolutionary dynamics in the wild. And that was in 1964. But I don't believe that we actually accomplished this until the last 40 years, truth be told. And so this is the primary insight behind what I see as a second major biological synthesis, what I refer to as the second synthesis, because I think we are undergoing something of an empirical revolution in biology over the past 40 years. You see, historians and biologists are quick to note the relative disconnect between ecology and evolutionary biology, exemplified in this quote by Massimo Pigliucci here. So I'm going to read this quote in full. The modern synthesis basically ignored ecology, despite a strong research program in evolutionary ecology, so much so that ecologists and evolutionary biologists now hardly talk to each other. We have no organic theory of how community, ecosystems, ecology are connected to evolutionary biology. Yet, while there is some truth that for the majority of the institutional histories, ecology and evolutionary biology have developed somewhat independently of one another, largely because ecologists and evolutionary biologists typically publish in different journals, attend different conferences, and divide interdepartmentally. However, I find the history to be so much more nuanced than what most authors imply. That is, in the rare occasions where ecology and evolutionary biology have dated, dramatic theoretical progress has been the result. Thus, while ecology did not play a major role in the early development of evolutionary theory through the vehicle of population genetics, it did, however, play a much larger role in the overall acceptance of the population genetic viewpoint of evolution during the modern synthesis. And this progress is largely due to the background efforts of early evolutionary ecologists such as Theodosius Dobzhansky and E.B. Ford. And largely, Dobzhansky's genetics here published in 1937, because most historians consider this to be the trigger that ignited the modern synthesis. And thus, early evolutionary ecology was particularly influential on early evolutionary thinking, but it did not begin to inform evolutionary theory until the 1980s, which is when we begin to see an explosion of field studies of natural selection, largely due to the methodological advances spurred by establishing a quantitative standard to study natural selection dynamics in the wild, otherwise known as the Landian-Arnold framework. So, as reviewed in John Lendler's Natural Selection in the Wild, we began to finally understand how evolutionary dynamics play out over longer timescales and frequent spatial changes, which is furthered by the establishment of the evolutionary rescue and eco-evolutionary dynamics research front. Thus, from the 1980s onwards, I think an entirely different and novel picture of evolution has come to the fore. Hence why I see recent developments in evolutionary biology and ecology as another whole-scale biological synthesis, because its underlying causes and consequences are similar to that seen in the first synthesis. Thus, before the second synthesis, we generally thought of evolution as a slow and gradual process. Natural selection dynamics, as they play out in the complex space and time of nature, were relatively unknown, and the causal models or theories we constructed to explain evolution and natural selection were therefore largely abstract and reductive, because they had little empirical input from ecology. Now, following the subtle and organic synthesis between ecology and evolutionary biology over the past 40 years, we now know that evolution can proceed at faster rates and thus on a similar timescale to ecology. We have seen an exponential increase in our knowledge of natural selection dynamics, expounded in all the recent reviews of field studies over the past 20 years. And we've progressed past the asking of, is natural selection operating in natural populations, to asking the deeper question of, how is natural selection operating, or what is the nature of natural selection? Thus, our first generation models illuminated how selection varies in strength and direction, The second generation elucidated how selection and fitness vary spatial temporally. And as a result of the second generation, we're beginning to understand how evolution plays out over longer timescales and frequent spatial changes, thus revealing long-term evolutionary phenomena such as multi-level selection and evolvability that were once hidden in the purview of a reductive evolutionary biology. Which brings me to the last point here in red, which is more prescriptive than descriptive. Without question, we have recently experienced a massive increase in our knowledge of evolutionary and selective dynamics due to the second synthesis. Whenever we see such a massive increase in our epistemic reservoirs in the sciences, we should meet such progress with theoretical reflection. I therefore think we are existing in an intermediate stage of scientific progress that warrants turning all the new knowledge revealed by the second synthesis into useful and predictive theory. This is where the philosophy of biology can be of great use, but I'm going to put that idea on hold for the time being and just get into a bit of the science background and the evidential background here. So the paradox of adaptive genetic variation is the longest standing and most severe explanatory problem in the history of evolutionary biology. Because beginning with Darwin, evolutionary biologists have routinely failed to explain the evolution of adaptive genetic variation mechanisms, of sexual recombination, mutation, horizontal gene transfer, genetic transposition, and whole genome duplication events. And this is an active problem today, which is why it's such a useful example to use to demonstrate all the known issues with evolutionary theory, because its severity shines a particular spotlight on the philosophical anachronisms that still pervade an evolutionary theory that we originally derived from physics. Okay, so for a quick review here, this slide shows the basic modern synthetic model of natural selection, or how we used to think the process of natural selection played out. Essentially, the modern synthetic model saw natural selection as a two-step process that ensues in a one-way flow of causation from the first step to the second step. So in the first process, you have mutation and recombination mechanisms causing variation, but it's important to note that they cause variation randomly, meaning that they aren't generally influenced by the environment or that their subsequent phenotypic effects cannot be predicted, which is just fancy talk to say that mutations aren't directed, which I believe the latter sense of randomness has actually held up in the literature. The second step is what we classically understand as natural selection, which is when an environment selects for the variants that are the best adapted or having the highest fitness, while leaving or purifying less adapted variants. But of course, as I previously mentioned, these two causal processes don't ensue independently of one another. Natural selection can act on mutation modifiers, thus enhancing its own causal efficacy to cause adaptation or selection for selection. What's also wrong is the implicit assumption that was tagged onto this model from very early on, that natural selection only causes adaptation at lower levels of biological organization, at the genetic level of selfish genes or at the individual organismal level. Most prominently because our methodologies were limited to within population analyses for most of evolutionary research. And so this assumption was born out of the intellectual context that Stephen Jay Gould referred to as the hardening of Darwinism, which is when reputable evolutionary biologists began to infer from their mostly statistical interpretations that natural selection only acts at lower levels of biological organization at the behest of lower level entities such as selfish genes or individuals. This whole debacle, known as the group selection controversy of the 1960s, started when the ecologist Wynne Edwards posited that individuals may sacrifice their reproductive interests for population control, which was a good of the group or species type of argument. Such a provocation moved several of the most reputable evolutionary theorists to specifically attack the idea of group selection, which led to a suspicion of all higher level and emergent phenomena in evolutionary biology. Following this period, natural selection was universally seen to operate at lower levels, procuring adaptations that benefit selfish genes or individuals within a population. And as you can see by this quote here, this idea continues to this day. And so I'm going to read Jerry Coyne's quote here. As evolution predicts, we never see adaptations that benefit the species at the expense of the individual. Thus, some of our best and brightest within evolutionary biology today still cling to this assumption. However, there has been some dissension in the ranks to talk about higher level selection more openly in recent textbooks. Hence why I do believe that this debate is still alive and active. And quite interestingly, and this was one of my, favorite things I found in my historical research, was that the only exception to the individual selection assumption came from sex. Sex was the only phenomena that even the strictest of reductive Darwinians, that was R.A. Fisher, G.C. Williams, or Maynard Smith, ever considered to not fit within their theoretical models of natural selection. In my book, I go into more of the interesting back and forth between Maynard Smith and Williams, who first sought to explain sex within their reductive purview, However, after repeated failed attempts, Williams and Maynard Smith finally conceded to the idea of higher level selection as the primary causal force underlying sex and its maintenance. And so here's a perfect quote by Grant Bell, who is a recognized sexpert in the community, as well as sat on my thesis committee. Oh wait, sorry, I went one too much here. Okay, um, so this quote really sums up this era perfectly, I believe. So it was the very success of this attack on group selection which led population biologists to realize how embarrassing sex is. Most supposedly altruistic behaviors were quickly found either to have concealed advantages for the individual or else to be directed towards the welfare of closely related individuals. But sex appeared to fit into neither of these categories. If it permits the rapid mobilization of genetic variation, then this may be a matter of vital concern for the population, but does not in itself concern the individual. Evolutionary biologists thus found themselves on the horns of a dilemma. Either the apparently unsatisfactory hypothesis of group selection was indeed an adequate explanation for the maintenance of sexuality, or else a quite different hypothesis framed in terms of natural selection must be sought. So, as exemplified by Bell here, the unrelenting commitment of many 20th century evolutionary biologists to a reductive model of natural selection caused many of the same architects of this theory to notice an implicit and profound theoretical incongruency between natural selection and the available evidence on the evolution of genetic variation and, in particular, sex. The paradox of sex was thus officially recognized in the 1970s after reductive causal interpretations of natural selection became entrenched in evolutionary theory following the group selection controversy, thus raising the origin and maintenance of sex as a major explanatory issue for evolutionary biology that still largely continues to this day. Because sex is still widely regarded as one of the major unexplained phenomena in evolutionary biology, mostly because it's incredibly pervasive in eukaryotes. So why does sex present such a paradox to reductive theory? Well, because sex is well known as an emergent and population level feature that is also extremely costly to the individual. As it takes time and energy to find a mate, individuals only leave 50% of their alleles to offspring. There's a significant evolutionary detriment to having the amount of reproductive individuals in a species, otherwise known as the cost of males. So why do we sex then, given all of its costs? Well, sex does one thing in particular, and we've actually known this since August Weismann in the late 19th century. The genetic mixing seen in meiotic recombination is known to accelerate and facilitate adaptation due to the novel genetic variation that it produces at the population or species level. Empirical studies have repeatedly found a strong evolutionary benefit that comes along with outcrossing, or the interbreeding of unrelated individuals, as opposed to self-fertilization because of the evolvability benefits that it confers to higher level entities. However, what is less recognized today is that adaptive mutation functions as the exact same thing as sex for much the same reasons, coming along with the exact same explanatory issues. So beginning in the 1970s and 80s, researchers began observing increased mutation rates when they placed bacterial populations under stress. And this began to erode the fanciful and modern synthetic notion that all mutations are random, and began to imply that selection may actually increase mutation rates when a population is stressed, despite deleterious effects to individuals within the population. So the evolutionary biology community has undergone something of a bifurcation in models of mutational dynamics over the past 20 years, with the non-adaptive models of mutation, such as Drake's model or Michael Lynch's drift barrier hypothesis, struggling to maintain the past reductive theoretical tenets of natural selection theory, seeing natural selection as only a force that decreases mutation rates to conserve individual offspring viability. However, a new model has slowly and subtly been building in the literature known as the adaptive models of mutation that argues that natural selection can act to increase mutation rates, so as increasing the probability of fixing an advantageous genetic variant and facilitating adaptation when a population is stressed or in a novel environment. And so I'm not going to go into a great detail on all the empirical evidence supporting a lot of these notions, but one thing to note is just the long-term survival and evolutionary rescue of sexual populations. And the same goes with adaptive mutation here. So the big idea behind the paradox of adaptive genetic variation is that adaptive genetic variation mechanisms are emergent adaptations that benefit higher level entities when placed in a novel, stressful, or capricious environment, therefore driving adaptation. And this is not a new idea in the literature by any means, because this is how most evolutionary ecologists and conservational biologists think species respond to environmental changes, from either demographic rescue strategies, phenotypic plasticity mechanisms, or undergoing genetic adaptation. And of course, genetic adaptation subdivided into the three processes of production of novel variation, variability, conservation of variation, and staining variation, and the domestication of foreign elements. By the way, can you see this, by the way? Is this on the screen? Should I move this? The videos? Anybody?
No, we can't see
Can't see
videos.
a
I think.
video.
Oh, okay, good.
No.
Okay, because I have like a snapshot of everybody on Zoom here. So, um, okay, sorry. So all these three elements is what I refer to as genetic evolvability. I'm not going to be able to go into precisely why I view it this way, but I'll go a little bit into the research here. So a recent meta-analysis of 19 long-term studies performed in the wild, published in Science, by the way, in 2022 here, found a 2 to 4 times larger additive genetic variance in relative fitness, implying that genetic adaptation is a much more significant causal factor in the rescue of species than we previously thought. Most natural populations harbor an extensive amount of genetic variation. So why is this variation there? It doesn't benefit individuals, at least not in the short term. It doesn't benefit selfish genes. It's there because natural selection truly has foresight because of what has happened in hindsight. Environmental unpredictability is the only predictability in evolution, hence why most species harbor an extensive amount of genetic variation. So, in light of all the recent evidence, how do we solve the longest standing explanatory problem in evolutionary biology, the paradox of adaptive genetic variation? Well, this is where philosophy particularly comes into play, as we need the development of new theoretical and explanatory strategies to accommodate all the recent phenomena. We need to pluralize natural selection theory so that it's not strictly reducible to causation at lower levels, but is capable of explaining adaptation at higher levels and over longer timescales. We need to expand natural selection dynamics to include long-term selective phenomena. Thus, to finally solve the paradox of adaptive genetic variation calls for a pluralistic theory of natural selection that integrates several fringe ideas, including maintenance selection as the type of selection most commonly acting to maintain these mechanisms over time, species selection as the level that natural selection is operating at, multi-level selection to explain how selection operates between various levels, and evolvability as a new higher level dispositional property that is a determinative selection akin to individual fitness, or what selection is selecting for in populations and species. So why do we need to integrate these four elements? Well, because it leads to more virtuous theory. It increases our explanatory depth, our theoretical coherency, our evidential accuracy, our causal adequacy, and predictive power, which is, by the way, precisely what causal needs. And there's a beautiful book written by the philosopher, I forget his first name, but Schindler, and it's in 2018. It's on the scientific theoretical virtues. And I believe this is precisely how we need to compare and contrast theoretical arguments, is by standardizing a lot of these arguments and talking about these theoretical virtues. So hopefully we can go into a little bit more detail in the discussion on this. So after going through all the sex and adaptive mutation literature, I started asking myself, what is natural selection? Why have empiricists failed to see their results as clearly the result of higher level selection? Well, one reason that I came across is how we've always thought of the ontology of natural selection, how we perceive natural selection as playing out in nature. Here's a classic paper written by Richard Lewontin in 1970, where he represented the core causal field of natural selection, in which he argued that populations of individuals will undergo adaptive evolutionary change by natural selection when these three necessary and sufficient conditions are met: the conditions of phenotypic variation, differential fitness, and if fitness is heritable. However, there are numerous issues with this ontological model of natural selection, as it has difficulty when applied to complex biological settings. It specifically focuses on short-term selection dynamics, and perhaps most importantly, it only captures how evolution causes directional evolution, or how natural selection causes directional evolutionary change. And so herein lies the major issue with how we've been typically conceptualizing natural selection dynamics, perfectly exemplified by the man with the best facial hair in all the history of biology, G.C. Williams. So I regard it as unfortunate that the theory of natural selection was first developed as an explanation for evolutionary change. It is much more important as an explanation for the maintenance of adaptation. You see, so natural selection is not only a cause of evolution, but can act as a cause of evolution without actually causing evolution. Evolution is about biological change over time, but species aren't always changing. And natural selection can actually cause trait uniformity over time. We have, historically speaking, been so infatuated with how natural selection causes adaptive evolutionary change that we have completely forgot to ask, what is natural selection as a causal theory? And many long-term and highly conserved genetic mechanisms, such as the evolvability mechanisms previously discussed, are kept around in populations through maintenance selection. So this is my reworking of Lewontin's causal principles to accommodate such phenomena. And the cool thing is we don't need variation as a necessary precondition for natural selection. Also, we need to say that an adaptation is an adaptation under maintenance selection is that the trait or feature is heritable, and if this heritable trait is causally connected to the fitness at any level of biological organization, then the biological trait will undergo or is undergoing maintenance selection, meaning that the active ecological context is continuously selecting for this trait, and any disturbance made to this trait will lead to disastrous effects. And so here's a good empirical example of maintenance selection for genetic evolvability. So in this study performed by Ragheb et al. 2019, published in Molecular Cell, the researchers inactivated the transcription coupled repair factor MFD, which is known to have a dual functionality. So that in stable environments, MFD repairs DNA damage, but under stress, MFD is known to promote mutagenesis. So after inactivating MFD, the researchers found a significant decline in microbes' evolvability, or their evolvability to evolve antibiotic resistance. And I know one of the strains that they were investigating, tuberculosis, was found to be 1,000 times less likely to evolve antibiotic resistance after the inactivation of MFD, which is a really cool finding that has myriad medical potential. And it's also important to note that MFD is highly conserved across the prokaryotic domain, as well as having a functional homologue in the eukaryotic domain, implying strong and pervasive selection for its dual functionality and evolvability functions. And so this is also a recent review of not just this study, but another similar study to this in Nature Reviews Microbiology here, if you want to take a look. So in the context of everything discussed about genetic evolvability, we also need a multi-level selective framework to explain how selection operates between various and conflicting levels of biological organization, or how lower level features such as stress-induced mutagenesis or recombination affect the survival of populations or species over time, because evolvability is typically a population or species level trait. And so I don't know if you are a Twilight fan, but if you are, you get this probably better than everybody else here. This is what the research shows is how evolvability typically operates within a multi-level selective framework. Since stable environments typically allow individual level selection to dominate, but when environments change, higher level selection for evolvability becomes the major adaptive interest. And so this is how evolvability plays out in nature as a higher level fitness determinant, meaning that natural selection does not only select for greater individual fitness measures and higher fitness peaks, but also for the flexibility to traverse the adaptive landscape and reach new fitness peaks. So in my book, I've attempted to place evolutionary theory within its historical and philosophical context, thus revealing the philosophical anachronisms that are presently weighing down biologists and impeding scientific progress. The main issue I've noticed is that we have historically not looked at evolution in space and time. We have conceived of evolution as a relatively static process that happens in relatively static environments. Our methodologies only revealed short-term and individual level evolutionary phenomena, thus making our theory particularly reductive and not externally valid. Now, over the past 40 years, evolutionary biology has undergone something of an empirical revolution, whereby we now look at evolutionary and selective dynamics in the long term and over frequent spatial changes. As such, we are beginning to reveal long-term evolutionary phenomena such as evolvability or multi-level selection. So putting it all together into a visual model here, number one here, this is how we have traditionally looked at evolution from the perspective of within populations and at shorter timescales in relatively stable environments. In periods such as these, natural selection will automatically tend to place an emphasis at the individual level and or the lowest levels of biological organization, thereby selecting for enhanced individual fitness metrics. Evolvability and other long-term evolutionary phenomena are either A, dormant due to low environmental variability, or are B, appear to be dormant simply due to timescale choice. And so two here, an increase in environmental variability causes adaptive radiation to ensue and natural selection to select for higher level features. During these periods, the evolution of quote unquote weird evolutionary strategies such as social cooperation, the formation of new levels of biological organization, and or evolvability becomes more likely. Adaptive interest will tend to shift to the population or species, meaning that natural selection will tend to favor higher levels of biological organization and select for higher level fitness determinants such as evolvability, selecting for those populations of species that are capable of evolving to new environmental conditions over less evolvable populations or species. Number three here, this is during large scale changes in environmental conditions and when environmental variability and therefore selective pressures are at its highest peak, such as those seen in mass extinction events. This is when we see the evolution of the weirdest evolutionary strategies, such as whole genome duplication events, which are typically an evolutionary dead end in stable conditions. This is also when we are the likeliest to observe cooperation evolving between unrelated species or the emergence of entirely new levels of biological organization, otherwise known as major evolutionary transitions. And finally, following more environmental changes and following more time as well, traits become honed in what initially started as interlevel conflicts because of new traits evolving at higher levels and having that interlevel conflict. Over time, that conflict will dissipate and will be resolved following um, more of these changes in environmental variability. And so this is why I believe you should never trust anybody who says something akin to natural selection is not a forward-looking force, or natural selection has no foresight, or that natural selection is primarily an individual level phenomenon. Because I believe people who say these things don't understand the history of evolutionary biology, the philosophy of evolutionary biology, the empirical literature of evolutionary biology, but most importantly, natural selection as a causal theory. So that is the beginning of my first part of this presentation. So now I'm going to get into a little bit more of a speculative range. I've only been working on this book for about the last 2 months, so this is probably not as well set in stone here. But yeah, as I was performing my scientific research, I began to think about the social and spiritual implications of everything we've been talking about. And so, yeah, this is what I'm currently working on, which is hopefully my book called Disconnected from Nature, Modern Science Meets Indigenous Wisdom. And I'm just starting to send my proposal out to agents and publishers. So if anybody has any connections or can provide any help, I'd be eternally grateful here. So Disconnected from Nature is my attempt to reframe human history in light of our evolutionary history. And as such, it naturally corresponds with and validates an indigenous history. Disconnected from Nature marks the culmination of the big history books or the bold panoptic works that attempt to explain the whole sweep of man's history, such as Harari's Sapiens, Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, Fukuyama's The End of History, Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I don't think is a very well-written book, and David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. And so I also hope to juxtapose the lifestyles of indigenous peoples in comparison to our own today in modern society, demonstrating the areas where we have disconnected from the vital outlets that once allowed for our physical, emotional, and spiritual survival. So as I was traveling around the world, living in many different cultures, one word continuously came back to me, and that word was disconnected. Thus, I began to ask myself, what is the root cause or the biggest cause in most of human suffering today? What is the one cause that, if ameliorated or amended, would instill widespread progress, irrespective of culture or geography? And the one answer I kept getting back was being disconnected from nature, which includes our disconnection from our natural origins as a social and tribal species. And this also dovetails with a lot of the literature of ecopsychology and ecotherapy here, which is very interesting. And hopefully we can discuss a little bit in the discussion. So thus one of the first things I need to accomplish to successfully make my case is to juxtapose the livelihoods of our indigenous ancestors alongside modern life. So lifespans of our indigenous ancestors were relatively comparable, as those who survived to see their 15th birthday could reliably expect to live well into their 70s. Our ancestors enjoyed significantly more free time than we do today, only spending about 2 to 3 hours of work day, or yeah, only spending 2 to 3 hours a day of work. And with work only entailing fun and rewarding activities such as hunting, fishing, and gathering resources. And then food was both plentiful and more nutritious than modern diets. And largely because of that, modern medicine wasn't really needed. Non-infectious diseases and infectious diseases were virtually non-existent. Sociopolitics were largely egalitarian, with members sharing resources, or else they would suffer social exclusion or punishment. And tribal social environment allowed for the evolution of morality in the selection for pro-social behaviors and the purification of antisocial behaviors, which I believe is particularly relevant for the pro-social community, because I believe our early tribal environment actually acted as a selective sieve that selected for moral behaviors. and purified antisocial or psychopathic behaviors. And I don't believe our modern social environment does that today. And of course, for mental illness, since our ancestors lived under the constant protection of the tribe, cases of mental illness such as depression or anxiety were extremely rare. And in the occasional cases when they did manifest, other tribal members often celebrated and encouraged their presence, seeing them as signs of an intuitive power and higher state of knowing, that which is only bestowed upon medicine men and shamans. And thus, before we go any further, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. I know several of our participants today also were talking about this yesterday in the evolutionary philosophy group, the naturalistic fallacy, as well as the appeal to tradition fallacies. So while I do believe that it's true that just because something is old or natural doesn't imply that it is true or good. However, if something is old or natural, then it does have a greater likelihood of being true or good. And I don't mean old or natural in the sense of 5,000-year-old Mesopotamic anthropocentric monotheistic civilization-based beliefs. I mean old and natural in the sense that they have been around for tens of thousands of years, passed down from generation to generation by our indigenous ancestors who understood nature because they were connected to nature, since the likely debranching of the Homo lineage from its primate basis over 2 million years prior. Every person has an indigenous ancestor if you go back far enough. Hence why these fallacies aren't fallacies, but merely just heuristics. And what I observed in indigenous communities was a greater sense of physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being, largely because they are connected to nature. Although profound cultural differences exist between modern and indigenous cultures, common interweaving thread between all indigenous communities is their belief in an ecocentric worldview, or what's sometimes referred to as kincentric ecology, which is when humans view both themselves and nature as part of an extended ecological family that shares an ancestry and origins. In a similar vein, indigenous communities are often egalitarian because they also view their sense of self as living in other tribal members. This is a brilliantly written book by the war journalist Sebastian Junger here that goes into greater depth on this topic. Okay, so in human evolutionary history, the two major worldviews or ontologies, as I refer to them, are ecocentrism and anthropocentrism, in which ecocentrism refers to the belief that ecosystems have inherent value, whereas anthropocentric philosophy suggests that humans are the most important entity on Earth. Every major philosophy today can be traced back to one of these founding ontologies, and in particular, capitalism, nationalism, and imperialism are all founded within an anthropocentric worldview. Yet I believe modern science is beginning to validate an ecocentric ontology of the world. However, despite their salience, indigenous perspectives have been largely misunderstood over the past few hundred years, mostly because early anthropologists failed to live with and appreciate indigenous people in person. For example, E.B. Taylor, the founder of modern-day cultural and social anthropology, performed what we call today as armchair anthropology, where he argued that Darwin's ideas of evolution could be applied to human societies as he classified religion according to their so-called level of development, therefore imparting some level of directionality into the social evolutionary process, which I believe doesn't also hold in the natural evolutionary process. So hopefully maybe we can get to talking that a little bit too. So he coined the term animism as a classification for all early indigenous religions, which was the first stage or the lowliest of all the religions according or along an ascending order of rationality. Animism to polytheism to monotheism, which was the most civilized form of religion at that time. And so, from this perspective, animism was the most primitive kind of religion, while European Protestant Christianity was seen as the most evolved of all the religions. And of course, Taylor's protege Fraser did exactly the same thing, but a little bit worse. Thus, animism was seen as the attribution of souls to all objects, including inanimate objects. However, this is a grave mistranslation of two converging viewpoints. On one side, the ecocentric perspectives of the indigenous who did not view biological processes under a materialist or Cartesian mindset, in which there was no separation between the immaterial spirit or supernatural world and the real scientific materialist world. Anthropologists have thus largely failed to understand indigenous people because they did not live among them and understand them. Interestingly, if you've ever done psychedelics, you would come to understand how and why indigenous people believe all things have souls, which is why I won't go into great detail on this here, but perhaps we can also discuss this later because this is also quite an interesting part of the history. Thus, when we compare the lives of our ancestors relative to modern life today, one cannot help but ask when, where, why, and how did humans become so disconnected from nature? So, in a similar vein to Jared Diamond and Francis Fukuyama, I think the first major turning point in human history was the advent of agriculture, or rather, modern anthropological evidence suggests that certain people forced to evolve an agrarian lifestyle following the last ice age and significant environmental changes. So, as people were forced to finally settle down in one area to watch their crops, the production of the first food surplus led to materialism as a philosophy. Now that people could farm and sustain themselves, as well as build personal property, they were no longer in need of a tribal unit, so they became more individualized. But having more things and being more individualized allowed the opportunity for bandits to come and steal your things, which is likely why cities with big, massive walls were invented. Now, with a physical barrier in place, man became more disconnected from nature than ever before. And thus, to sustain the massive influx of people living in cities, cultures needed to evolve socio-political tools to enhance group cohesion. And as what I'm referring to as sociopolitical tools are, I see them as social developments, as adaptations. Since they were no longer living under a tribal mentality, I believe this is why they had to evolve these socio-political tools. And so this began to the start of a massive zero-sum game in which those cultures who could invent the best methods for enhancing group cohesion will become the most likely to survive, proliferate, and dominate weaker cultures. By the way, everything I'm discussing here is one massive oversimplification of the evolution of modernity. I just want to make that known, but it's just I'm using it as a useful outline of how and why certain historical developments unfolded in the way that they did, kind of like a causal field of the evolution of modernity. Thus, one of the best new sociopolitical adaptations was the invention of a new worldview, a new ontology, otherwise known as anthropocentrism. As the historian Lynn White Jr. argued in his now famous essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, the Judeo-Christian Bible was one of the first documents to explicitly give humans the right of dominion over nature. Since in the very first passages of Genesis, it states that humans were created in the image of God and are constructed to subdue earth and to have dominion over all other living creatures. Anthropocentric stories viewed humans as fashioned in the likeness of God or gods, sitting at the top of arbitrary orders. For example, Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle organize all of the Earth's entities into the great chain of being, seen here on the right, and I hope that it's on the right for you guys as well. Which is a social hierarchy that respectively placed humans at the top of a descending order above animals, plants, rocks, and minerals. Humans were considered as more important or godlier than other animals, and animals were more important than plants or rocks. And the philosopher Protagoras emphasized the role of humans as a primary focal for understanding the world when he wrote, "Man is the measure of all things." And thus, our disconnection from nature reached new heights in the early modern period, during the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras. There was a renewed focus on human reason, knowledge, and progress in Western countries that was largely inspired by the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, and then meshing it with medieval religious zealotry, which was a very dangerous brew of two of the most anthropocentric philosophical doctrines during this time. And Renaissance philosophers such as Rene Descartes promoted the idea of dualism, which is the belief that mind and matter are separate and the realm of the mind does not directly interact with the world of matter. And since dualistic thinking encourages us to see our minds as separate from the natural world, it has become easier for humans to view ourselves as a special and unique species that exists outside of the traditional bounds of the natural world. As a result, much of modern Western thought, whether it be from science, philosophy, economics, etc., became highly anthropocentric. All of our supposedly good ideas about the world were centered around anthropocentric ideas, and we began to view nature as a machine under the viewpoint of instrumentalism, where nature was seen as something to exploit to meet human needs. Anthropocentrism and its philosophical corollary instrumentalism became central and foundational tenets of thought in most Western and modern societies during the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, further disconnecting humans from their natural roots and origins. Thus, during the colonial era, the massive carnage and exploitation of resources provided fuel for the rising industrial economies of the European powers. As human societies began to prosper or grow in numbers, they became more urbanized and shifted from mostly agrarian economies to industrial societies. and there's a growing emphasis on human control, the exploitation of natural resources, and the usage of technology to shape and dominate the world. This rise of mechanization and mass production brought on a heavy reliance on machinery and manufactured goods. Factories, pollution, and urban sprawl disrupted natural ecosystems and removed people from having direct contact with nature. Thus, as a result of what I deem as the fuck around centuries of the 18th and 19th century, otherwise known as the Industrial Revolution, the 20th and 21st centuries are rapidly becoming the find out centuries. Since the 20th century, humans have upgraded our levels of disconnection to potentially perilous extinction type levels. Thus, in the grand scheme of things, the notion that humans are separate from the natural world is a relatively recent and relatively Western intellectual development. For most of our evolutionary history, humans lived in a harmonious balance with nature because they saw nature as a part of themselves under an ecocentric worldview. Yet the development and increasing popularity of anthropocentric Western ideas has put us in a precarious position. And since much of Western thought and philosophy, from science, economics, sociology, and political science, holds its roots in an anthropocentric worldview rather than an ecocentric worldview, the entire intellectual edifice of Western thought is founded on a scientifically ignorant worldview. Our sociopolitical structures, our habits and ways of life, and our attitudes towards nature and each other are all founded on a remarkably disconnected worldview. And so in part 2, I shift from a negative viewpoint of human history to a positive one, elucidating the steps of the return to nature movement in the sciences and the primary thinkers or players who began to question the monolithic foundations of anthropocentrism. So quite interestingly, modern science was primarily founded as an attack on specific aspects of anthropocentric philosophy. For example, Galileo, Giordano Bruno, and Nicholas Copernicus challenged the powerful orthodoxy of geocentrism, which was a corollary of anthropocentrism, and posited a heliocentric model of the universe. In his now famous essay, Discourse on Inequality, the Genevan philosopher and composer Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the first to forcibly argue that the development of agriculture and the establishment of property rights created massive social inequality and a separation from nature. He believed that the transition from the natural state, or from the state of nature, which was hunter-gatherer ecocentrism, to civil society came at a significant cost. Individuals who entered society became subject to laws and institutions written by men whom they did not know. They became alienated from the natural state, and most importantly, they lost the essence of humanity and morality itself. In short, society constrains and suppresses our natural instincts towards morality and pro-social behaviors that once existed in our ancestors. And then came Darwin, who humbled mankind and reminded us of our forgotten ancestry and origins with the rest of life, with his idea of descent with modification, which recognized the fact that humans are not separate or specially created species. And such a profound realization shifted our perspective from seeing humans as distinct from nature to viewing them as a product of natural processes. However, Darwin's theory of natural selection, which is the most important theory in biology, comes with the added corollary that most people fail to recognize. And that is that humans are not fashioned in the image of some anthropomorphic God, but rather in nature itself. Nature is God, so to speak. Natural ecological environments select for beneficial characteristics and purify disadvantageous characteristics in species, thereby fashioning us into who and what we are today. So what I'm describing here is taking the idea of natural selection and looking at its spiritual and existential consequences. And those are that humans were formed in nature, with nature being our grand creator, so to speak. However, Darwin was imperfect as a thinker. Being a product of 19th century Victorian England, he openly denigrated indigenous populations for being uncivilized. He was also a product of reductionist thought in early biology, before it was called biology, and characterized evolution in the context of nature red in tooth and claw, i.e., as a struggle for existence, both mistakes that left his theory of evolution and natural selection open to misinterpretation by future social and political theorists. Thus, Darwin's ideas were taken, misappropriated, and misinterpreted to an extent as support for racist socio-political narratives such as social Darwinism or the eugenics movement. The Darwinian survival of the fittest competition-based viewpoint of evolution championed laissez-faire capitalism and other ecologically disastrous public policies. In the words of the social Darwinist himself, Ernest Haeckel, who said, "Politics is applied biology." And what's interesting here is that I do agree with him, but I do not agree with how social Darwinists have always conceived of evolution. Thus, in the 1960s and 70s, a new picture of evolution has been building in the literature. Biologists such as our own David Sloan Wilson or E.O. Wilson have built a solid case against the traditional Darwinian competition-based viewpoint of evolution and have expanded Darwinian theory to accompany entire populations or species, otherwise known as multi-level selection theory. What this means is that our environments don't merely select for the most adapted individuals, but also for the most adapted populations or species. Our being, our very existence, or our sense of self, if you will, lives at multiple levels of biological organization. And this is why pro-social behaviors such as altruism or trust have evolved and can readily evolve given the right environmental context. Because those populations or species with greater amounts of altruism or trust will eventually outcompete those that are more selfish over the many courses of time. And around the same time that MLS theory was gaining traction amongst biologists, the mother of the microworld, Lynn Margulis, was also attacking the Darwinian competition-based viewpoint of evolution from a micro perspective. Margulis's empirical investigations led her to challenge the orthodoxy of Darwinism from the vantage point of microbiology. And as the microworld seemed to suggest that evolution was less about competition between biological entities, as we previously assumed, but more about cooperation and collaboration between completely unrelated species. Such findings led Margulis and an English scientist named James Lovelock to conceive of a new way to look at life on Earth called the Gaia hypothesis, named after the Greek goddess who personified the Earth, Gaia. And the Gaia hypothesis postulates that the entire biosphere on Earth is a synergistic and self-regulating biological entity in its own right, undergoing the same biological principles of Darwinian evolution, but on a larger scale. And so the entire Earth's ecosystem seemingly interacts just as that, as a living, breathing, interacting, and interconnected system. And humans are very much a part of that system. It follows from the Gaia that humans exist as supporting actors in a play that is so much bigger and more magnificent than merely our own actions. Thus, in short, new ideas from the frontiers of modern biology, including but not limited to multi-level selection theory and the Gaia, redefine what it means to be human, and in turn, they should inspire us to rethink our social organizations. MLS theory radically alters how we look at and treat our fellow human beings, and the Gaia radically alters how we look at and interact with nature. Most of the socio-political ideas in modern Western society, however, are predicated on an anachronistic and scientifically debunked viewpoint of biology. We must thus incorporate modern biology into our future if we are to ensure our long-term success as a species. And similar to our indigenous ancestors, we should view our sense of self as existing in nature. However, unlike our indigenous ancestors, who are sometimes violent against other tribes, we should also view our sense of self as living in other humans within our species. We now have the intellectual tools to see ourselves in others. So I'm going to skip that one for now. Thus, I think we as a species must move towards a nature-based, scientifically inspired, and ecocentric worldview in spirituality. By constructing societies that more closely resemble those of our ancestors, we can reconnect with nature and fix many of the ills that are associated with modernity. We must borrow from the ancient wisdom maintained within indigenous cultures and employ it in our modern context, in conjunction with modern science, to construct a better world for all living beings. And with that, I want to say thank you to everybody. I'm just learning Gen Z slang, so this means big up Slayers, means thank you, everybody. You guys have been a great audience. And if you wouldn't mind, I just started my GoFundMe for this book a few days ago. So if you wouldn't mind donating, most of this money will be so I can write this book in the next year or two, and as well as go live with the Quechua people in Peru. And yeah, live within more indigenous communities. So with that, I believe we can start our discussion, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to hear me out.
You're great. That was
How did I
awesome.
do on timing, by the way?
Oh, you had a lot to say, so we're fine. We have 22 minutes left to go in our allotted time, and
Oh, okay.
and
Dang.
for those who want to stay, we can go longer. Let's stop sharing the screen so we can see each
Yeah,
other again. This
sounds
is our
good.
research seminar series, which allows us to geek out as much as we want. And so I
Yeah,
hope we all enjoyed our particular geek out experience.
yeah,
And there's so much to say. And I was raise your yes,
Yeah.
raise your virtual hands to form a queue. Um, and gosh, I don't even know where to begin. So I hope someone else begins. So someone else raise their hand and begin the questioning, and I'll collect my thoughts. Don't be timid now.
I can't particularly see anybody, so if somebody sees somebody.
Okay, here we go. So I can, Beth, here we go. Now we're lining up here. So Steve and then Marilyn.
Good. Yeah.
Hi, I would like to hear more about your view regarding animism. And you had shown a slide regarding how that, if I recall correctly, brought how that view in indigenous communities helped establish pro-social behavior in those communities.
How animism in particular established pro-social behaviors?
Right, and I have a sense of that. But also I'd like to, you mentioned when you showed the animism slide that you'd like to maybe dovetail back to that.
Yeah.
More about that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that in more detail.
Well, I don't know precisely how to answer that at the moment because the main thing that I believed has allowed for pro-social behaviors has been maintaining that social tribal unit or a community level unit that acts as a selective sieve for pro-social behaviors and then purifies disadvantageous behaviors. However, there is probably some senses where animism as a whole, even though I believe it's better framed as ecocentrism. I do believe that allows more better spiritual as well as social and physical well-being. And I believe this is the entire literature behind eco-psychology that's looking at this and ecotherapy at the moment, showing that humans really do need to be in connection with nature. So in that sense, I believe it does encourage a lot of pro-social behaviors. But I don't. The main thing that I was talking about, disconnected from nature, was maintaining that community unit as the primary social unit. So yeah, I don't know if that answers any of your question at all, but
it does somewhat.
Yeah, and I should also note too that most anthropologists today, I forget who is our one anthropologist here today, so I really hope that she can speak up and help me here. But most anthropologists today, actually in the 1960s, I believe they stopped using the term animism just because of its its somewhat racist connotations. So now today, I think it's just like a big area of research. But as the one slide shows, I do believe that that a whole lot of, at least a lot of philosophers don't give a lot of time to this topic. So I believe we do need to talk about this a lot more.
Okay, great.
Thank
Marilyn.
you.
Yes, hi. Mitch, thanks. It was a great presentation, and all through it, something kept popping in my head. So I just want to throw it out to you if you have any comment. Do you have an evolutionary biological perspective on what appears to be an increasing amount of gender fluidity? I don't have scientific proof of that, but it certainly appears that gender fluidity is on the rise. And I've even read some recent articles about it appearing in nature among other species. So, I, through contemplation or reflection, I have my own perspectives and theories. I'm just curious to know if you've given it any thought, and do you have a perspective on it?
Yeah, of course, I've given it a lot of thought, but I don't believe I'm nowhere even close to an expert on this topic, and I don't think I think I'm quite ignorant on this topic. So with that being saying, I know that there are explicit examples of course hermaphrodites in nature, but also having that gender fluidity at the exact same moment. So this is not something that I'm particularly knowledgeable, nor from a political reason. I just don't feel like I am knowledgeable enough to talk about it. So yeah, this is one thing that this is so weird because coming back to the United States, like I've lived outside the United States for 10 years now. So like coming back into like the tribal community of the United States, like I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I don't really believe in either sides and I don't know what's going on. But once I got thrown back in this environment, I was like, whoa, I don't know what's going on. So yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for that is my best answer. So I apologize.
Hey,
But I know
thank you.
that there are several books on this, by the way. So I forget
Yeah,
what they call it.
it's one of many great topics.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
David,
Skip me
skip
for
you?
just
Okay, for the
one-
moment.
for the moment.
Yep.
I've got
You were composing one of your great
yeah.
comments. So Kate, and then I'm going to take my
Okay.
turn.
Thank you so much, Mitch. This is amazing. I come to you as the director of the Spiritual Communities Initiative at ProSocial World, so you can see that I'm a bridge builder as well between scientific and spiritual communities, realizing that we're really talking about the same thing with different vocabulary. But I'm also a historian by training, so I'm really drawn into your foundational approach toward history of science. And my limited exposure to history of science was that, again, two disciplines speaking two different languages. How would you assess, I really appreciate where you came to see turning points in history of science where, major shifts took place. Where would you assess where we are right now in terms of the shifts in culture that are both deeply tribal and deeply troubling in terms of the lack of decorum, for lack of a better term? Are you looking to current events with that, or are you looking to ground this in science?
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant question. And I think I've given this a lot of thought. For the first part that you were discussing here, I believe that there is just a massive, because of course I was one, I believe that there's just a massive spiritual void in the world right now, because so many people, especially young people, are leaving organized religion and they don't really know what to believe in at that moment. And so I do believe that, sports teams, political parties, these take on this tribal mentality, and it gives these people this sense of self and this identity, this social identity. But I don't believe that it is the best way that we can organize. I believe politics should be more played out at a community level, and then we should have another higher level at the entirety of the species at that moment. And I believe this is kind of what multi-selection theory does in a sense, is it allows that intellectual tool to view ourselves as existing at multiple levels. Just because we don't just have adaptations built into our genomes that are there that benefit me, Mitch, the individual, but are there that benefit all of us within a species. And this is precisely what I was trying to get at in my first part of the talk, is that why we have all this variation is just because it benefits species to evolve and adapt to novel environmental circumstances in the future. So I believe this is kind of the way that we need to evolve to see ourselves as existing, as individual level, tribal community level, species level, but then also within nature.
Oh, that is music to my ears. I'm looking forward to speaking with you more, Mitch.
Yeah,
what you
me too.
described is what Father Thomas Keating, who is a Trappist monk who founded the centering prayer, he spoke in evolutionary terms as the mythic membership. So within spirituality, we have people that are thinking in evolutionary terms. Within science, we have people that have their own inner life. And, I want to join you in, bridging this gap between what we see as speaking two different languages, which is really saying the same thing. So thank you. Looking forward to talking more.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, that is great. And I have two kind of big areas I'm eager to discuss. Yes. I'll start with the first one. I loved the part of your talk on your biology part of the talk, in part because, of course, this is my area and I was a participant in it. But over the last 10 years or so, I've been concentrating so much on this human-related stuff that I've lost touch with the biological literature. So I really learned a lot from you. Thank you about your review of the biological literature. And what I found myself thinking is that something that you didn't cover very much was dual inheritance theory, which is, of course, as you know, the idea that in our species there's two two inheritance systems, the genetic stream and the cultural stream. And to really take that seriously, I think requires deriving the cultural analogs of everything that you said biologically, and including such things as recombination, a directed component evolution, and so on and so forth. So that's really exciting, and part of what we're doing. And I'm reminded of one of the very best colleagues in this is Terry Deacon, and I think you're probably familiar with his work on the symbolic species. Well, he's coined this term symbolically eusocial, and basically the glue that holds human societies together is not so much genetic related. And of course, that's a big factor, but it's really the fact that we're all, in any particular group, we're all thoroughly enmeshed in the symbolic system of that group, and there's no way to dissociate ourselves from that, from literally from the cradle to the grave, and the cradle part, child development from a cultural evolutionary perspective. So I think that there's a whole field of inquiry there. But what does it mean for there to be a cultural inheritance system? And then for everything that you covered biologically, to search for analogs of that, not too narrowly. There does not need to be, in fact, there will not be a point-for-point comparison. We don't have to find memes, for example, that correspond to genes. That was one of the first kind of wrong turns of the Dawkins version of cultural evolution. But I guess this is more a statement than a comment. I'll invite you to reply.
Oh no, I have plenty that I think I could comment on that.
But one thing first that I think that has become conventional for the study of cultural evolution is cultural group selection. Whatever people might say about genetic group selection, they say our species is a highly group selected species. Cultural evolution takes place largely at the group level. And so to me, I think most of the people working certainly in the Richardson Boyd tradition, that includes people like Joe Henwick and Michael Muthakrishna, that's the most successful school of thought about human cultural evolution. The fact that we're a highly group selected species culturally is pretty much carried the day. So not heretical in that context. And I'd be interested in your own impressions on that.
Yeah. No, so first off, I'd like to recognize that I'm very much a newbie in this area because I think during my studies, at least the last 10 years, I religiously tried to stay away from cultural evolution. And I just tried to focus. I basically just tried to write my book in terms that a population geneticist or any geneticist can understand. But now I think, of course, going through everything, I think I started to apply it to larger contexts, larger social contexts. But I'm not very well read in the field of cultural evolution at this point. So this is why these are very interesting things. But one thing that I was intrigued, and I have been thinking about that it does relate back to my evolution in space and time kind of thing, the biological analog and the cultural analog. With this, it's just looking to evolution as a nonlinear process, that it's not actually a directional progressive improvement of society, but recognizing that how well adapted a species is in one environment. When environments change, that doesn't mean that they will still be adapted, or that an adaptation in this environment is not an adaptation in this environment. And I think that this is really important to understand in the latter part of what I'm talking about, because what I originally see as initial social adaptations, the invention of the rule of law, of monotheistic religion, and these things that increased or enhanced group cohesion, I believe those were actually adaptations in a very early form of our context. But I believe now in our current context, especially the fact that in our globalist world today, and given our issues with global climate change, I believe that these have turned into to the exact opposite of adaptations. I believe that this is something that is quite disadvantageous to us. So yeah, that is one way that I've thought of applying it in the book, in a sense that what was once an adaptation is no longer an adaptation, and we shouldn't look at it as an adaptation, and we should evolve new adaptations to meet this new environment that we're in.
Yeah, great. So much to talk about. David, are you ready?
Yeah.
Or see, David, you want some more time? If
No, I'm up here. Let's let my app speak for me.
okay.
I did not realize this session would be almost entirely about biological evolution. But I'll offer my point anyway. My own interest is in social evolution, specifically the rise first of tribal forms of organization, then centuries later the rise of hierarchical institutional forms, then more centuries later the rise of market forms or organization, and now lately the rise of network forms of organization. As societies learn to use and combine these four forms, they increase their levels of complexity and evolvability. So, I'm in agreement that multilevel selection matters. But I remain puzzled by how much emphasis MLS theory keeps receiving. It seems too insufficient to qualify as an explanatory theory. Evolution is as much about new forms of organization as new levels. It is the rise and growth of new forms that generates new levels of complexity, not the other way around. Thus, I'd offer that multiform variation M.
Multivar. I didn't get that last part. I'm sorry.
Wait.
Wait, there's more.
Oh, okay. If you want to put it in the chat, that would be helpful too.
No, this is
I did not realize this session would be almost entirely about biological evolution. But I'll offer my point anyway.
I'm sorry. This
Oh,
thing.
no.
Look. My point is simply that we need a multi-form adaptation theory alongside multi-level selection. I'll leave it at that.
I think
David,
that yeah,
Oh,
I
sorry,
mean,
go ahead.
first you and then me.
Well, no, I was just gonna ask if David could put it in the chat because I think I'd understand it a little bit better. But also, it's a question that I don't feel like an expert in. So, David, if you do want to take this away, that would probably be better
Well,
than
I
me.
think that your talk was much about that. I mean, your talk was a little bit about multi-level selection theory, but it was also about such things as the evolution of novelties and so on. And so I think that you actually address both. And in my own mind, I think that multi-level selection theory addresses both. So I mean, basically, the way we frame things is in terms of generalized Darwinism. That in the first place, Darwin and his contemporaries knew nothing about genes per se. They thought broadly about inheritance. Then we had the modern synthesis, which I call the Great Constriction, where the study of evolution got confined mostly to Mendelian genetics. And now we have an expansion, which and the best name for it is generalized Darwinism, that focuses on Lewontin's 3, variation, selection, replication. Any process that combines those ingredients, regardless of the mechanisms, are counts as a Darwinian process. And that opens us up to just about everything: personal evolution, cultural evolution, artificial intelligence. All are Darwinian processes that possess the dynamic of multi-level selection, which is that cooperation at one scale is typically disruptive at higher scales. So something that counts as adaptive for an individual or for a tribe, or they work well, they qualify as some kind of organism, but they do what organisms do to their environment and to other organisms. It's frequently conflictual. There's negative externalities. And so if you want to solve cooperation problems, it's not enough to solve it at middle levels, lower levels. It has to be ultimately the scale of the entire Earth. We have to turn the Earth into an organism, something which does not exist now. So Gaia does not exist. The idealized form of Gaia does not exist in the current present day, and it needs to be brought into existence. So that's the brief view, without going too far. Let comment on that briefly, Mitch, and we'll return to Marilyn.
No worries. No. Oh yeah, sorry. No, I was just gonna say to the last part. I mean, you said everything beautifully, but actually, a lot of evolutionary biologists are working on the Gaia right now, and I know in particular, Ford Doolittle is writing a book on the Gaia, and at least like from an evolutionary biology and an empirical standpoint at the previous moment. So, and there's also a Gaia group going on in Nova Scotia there, and at Halifax University, and I know a lot of philosophers of biology are working on this, such as John Ducret in Exeter right now. So I think the modern literature is moving that way, but I think we just need to define what exactly is meant by the Gaia. And of course, the notion of individuality plays probably the biggest role in this question. So
yeah. Marilyn.
Yeah, hopefully this is a good follow-up question for you both, Mitch and David, on what you just were talking about. I'm not a researcher, but I consider myself a thinker. So can you tell me, is there currently a perspective amongst the cultural evolutionary researchers and the biological evolutionaries to realize that there's an interconnection between the two, that actually culture can influence biological evolution and vice versa, that there's an interaction, an adaptive interaction between the two? Are they thinking broadly enough?
Yes, by all means, at different timescales. And one of the most interesting timescales, Marilyn, is the individual person. That the way we think, our symbolic systems interact with our biologies, our individual biologies, through the upregulation and downregulation of genes, profoundly. So, I mean, there's studies which show that meditating, for example, up or down regulates a very substantial proportion of one's genes. So there's a dynamic that takes place for the individual person, and then there's a coevolutionary dynamic that takes place multi-generationally, all the way back to the origin of our species. That's how entwined they are. And Teilhard de Chardin has a beautiful quote on that. I can't quote it exactly, but it's about the social matrix that surrounds the individual child, without whom he cannot be extracted, without just incurring just complete damage to his being. And so there's no such thing. I mean, just human development takes place in a social matrix. There's just no way around it. And there's beautiful work on that. I think that's Mitch, what do you have to say about it?
Well, the only thing I could add on to that was that I know the philosophical literature on causation is really giving us tools to finally talk about this. And this is when I was talking about this reciprocal model of causation beforehand, where natural selection influences mutation modifiers and vice versa. So I believe that there are tools to start talking about this more, but I like I said, I'm not as well read in the cultural evolution or social evolution literature, so I wouldn't be able to make any specific claim. But I believed I know no matter what we no matter where we apply a lot of these the ideas in the philosophy of causation, I believe it can really help a lot of people understand and explain a lot of the processes that they're trying to.
I just want to add a comment. I hope you think it's interesting. I was asking about adaptation, interactive adaptation from an evolutionary perspective. Is evolution changing biology to adapt to some of the problems that exist in culture, just such as is gender fluidity a response evolutionarily to generations, thousands of years of patriarchy? It's just kind of an interesting thought process of evolution as this big thing of becoming and constantly changing and evolving. And I don't think it's helpful to look at the individual biological evolution separate from the cultural. So I appreciate your comments on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, with gender fluidity, I think that there is a number of quite different and complementary approaches. One is quite reductionistic, and one possibility is that gender, of course, is influenced mechanistically by such things as hormones. And if you put hormone mimics all throughout the environment, then you can basically get the response to that would would be a degree of gender fluidity, which is, you would call it an evolutionary mismatch. It's not adaptive, it's a disruption of regulatory pathways. So there's that whole piece. But then there's also gender fluidity as a cultural adaptation. And if you look, for example, at the bonobos, one of our closest primate relatives, and the degree of sexuality that takes place among many categories, what you see is that sex is a social currency. It's not just a mode of reproduction, it's a social currency in the animal world and in the human world. And if, for example, you need female coalitions to gang up against males to prevent violence by males, so now you have female coalitions, often some of the social glue for those coalitions is not just such things as grooming and so on, but it's sexual behavior. And so there's many examples of that in non-human species, because sex is a social currency in addition to a mode of reproduction, and there's a whole diversity of uses to which it has been put. And so the cultural history of gender fluidity is like that, and that so it goes on and on like that. And I wonder, Beth, I have my second major comment, but Beth, please.
No, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
I
You go ahead.
don't have a brilliant comment though. I was I was just going to let folks know if they needed to hop off. It's past 1:30, but we're more than happy to stay on. So I'm lowering my hand, David, and please, if you pose your question or comment.
Well, when we really think of cultural diversity as like biological diversity, then it encourages us to think of single cultures as like a single species. And biologists, when they study species, as you know, they don't do a lot of lumping. In fact, one of the problems with early ecosystem ecology was too much lumping into categories like carnivores and herbivores or so on, whereas the more sophisticated approach to ecosystem ecology is to realize ecosystems are composed of many species. Each species has an adaptive strategy. It's an adaptive unit. And then they interact with each other. And how they interact isn't necessarily adaptive in the aggregate. So an ecosystem is not automatically like a species. So when we take all of that and you move it over to the study of cultures, for one thing, I think it should make one a little bit skeptical about the degree of lumping that many people do, and I think what you did also in your talk, when we talk about like indigenous societies writ large or something like that, where we really should be studying each and every indigenous society as having a cultural evolution history, a particular worldview that evolves in response to that. And that worldview, in terms of who it serves, is not necessarily respectful of nature and not necessarily respectful of other people. There's a real tendency to over-romanticize any people. And I think, which ultimately, in the first place, it's just false. And in the second place, it doesn't really serve our purposes. So, why is it that the megafauna went extinct? I mean, the native people were not so conservation minded that they did anything about that. Colonization of the Pacific Islands, again and again, it drove the extinction of the species, which had no defenses against humans. Tribes, precisely as Peter Turchin, in his wonderful work on human history, talks about the Western societies. Cooperation always exists at a certain scale above which you find warfare. and indigenous people are no different. And whenever there's a power imbalance, such as a new technology, such as the use of horses or the use of firearms, then you get imperialism. You get empire. And that was true for the first Native American tribes that were able to use horses, the first ones that got firearms. And why should we expect otherwise? I mean, when the Puritans arrived at Plymouth Rock, there were indigenous societies that were just it was very recognizable in terms of the politics that was taking place on this side of the Atlantic compared to and then the entire relationships that formed were, super political. And there's all the scholarship you need to demonstrate that. So it's so much more nuanced. And there is a very strong sense in which this ecocentric view and a more of a systemic view is a property of indigenous thought. So I think, there's so much to be done, but for it to be done in a way that's true to the science, the anthropology, and so on, is what's needed. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to do as an organization is take the is to take the lead of that. So there's a lot there, and I just wonder what anybody here in this room thinks about that. Starting with you.
I can comment more specifically about it though. So obviously, everything I was presenting was more of a general view of how things, went on, and this is not. This is only because, of course, this is my first book that I'm attempting to write. So I'm attempting to generalize findings and not go through the entire history, because I think the best book that's done this recently is The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And so they talk about that more nuanced version of history. And of course, I think with the megafauna, I think with a lot of ecological destruction regarding the Rapa Nui, I forget what's the island, Easter Island. I believe there are a lot of instances in it, as well as with the Mayan Empire as well. You can't always say that they're ecocentric in a very broad term, but they were. I think this is the big issue that I'm having, is trying to, say like, what is the commonality between everybody? But there isn't so much commonality because the cultures are so incredibly diverse. There is a little bit of commonality, which you touched on. So I think it's got to be done in a way where I recognize the historical nuance, but also can talk about this in general terms for people to understand. And so this is one thing that I'm thinking about making the claim as well, is that a lot of these cultures who did go extinct, and I know Jared Diamond talks about this more explicitly in his book Collapse, they went extinct precisely because they were disconnecting from nature, and what they were doing was, they were deforesting everything around them. They had terrible agricultural techniques, which led to bad soil. So I think that this is one area that I'm thinking about, talking about in more nuanced sense. But yeah, I don't know if that answers anything there, but
yeah,
I understand that there is a lot more nuance to the anthropological history here, and so I want to do it justice, but do it justice in a way that I can still write a popular science book about it and not, make it dull. And that's the balance.
I just have to add a little codex on Easter Island, because one of my colleagues at Binghamton, Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt, have basically revolutionized that. And the Jared Diamond account of Collapse on Easter Island is actually not correct. And Easter Island, it is actually a case of sustainability. So that's a beautiful piece of work. So cooperation does exist. In that case, well, it's that complex. But anyhow, let's see if we have some wrap-up comments. And actually, what we could do, what's often a lot of fun, is to check out with a single word. But first, are there any other comments, more extended comments? Does anyone want the last word before we check out with a very brief single words?
I'll say one thing, Mitch. I just wanted you to know that there are lots of pretty great comments in the chat with some resources that folks in the audience have offered to you, and I will be glad to send you a copy of the chat, so you have that information if that's helpful.
Perfect. No, I love that. Yeah, I'd love to.
And Kathleen.
Well, I just want to quickly throw out the fact that my thought about the role of consciousness in human and cultural evolution, and to not pose a question or unpack any discussion, but to say, I think there's a missing piece in terms of understanding. you know, the link between individual and group awareness of one another and consciousness, and the kinds of trajectories that I think underlie a lot of our motivation in trying to, in studying and learning about prosociality and practicing it. And I just, which is why I put in the chat the comments about interpersonal neurobiology, brain development, and awareness of one another. So I'll just leave with that this is a very exciting and in-depth presentation, and thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
And if you haven't checked out the literature on ecopsychology, I know they go into, great depths to talk about that. So yeah. That's something I don't know so much about, but yes, thank you for your comment.
Well, I'm just, this is so exciting, and to be actually creating an organization to catalyze this. I think that many of your complaints about science that you voice in the preface of your book.
Oh man, I was hoping you didn't read that. Well, thank
you. Well, we've heard about renegade economists, but now we have renegade biologists, and
that's what I told Dunia too when I first met her. So
yeah. So anyhow, great to have you, and I hope that basically that you do become a member of your community. You could become a very important member of our community. You have so much to offer, and so be nice to do things together as my checkout. And shall I reel off some names? Steve, would you like to do a really brief checkout?
Sure. There was a whole lot to unpack, so I'm definitely going to watch the tape. And I encourage anyone who wants to explore a different country, go to Peru. I went about 2 decades ago and had a wonderful time engaging with the Quechua people, and it's just fascinating delving into their worldview.
Susan.
My one word is gratitude. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Beth.
Thank you, David. Mitch, my one word is inspired. And I do want to thank you for reaching out and doing this presentation. It was just mind-blowing. It really was. So thank you. And Marilyn.
Peace.
Andrew.
Yeah, I'll say intrigued. I was listening. I was in transit, so I was listen only. So I'm looking forward to watching the recording and seeing all the visuals, and also just getting a chance to kind of digest it again. But I've been thinking a lot about a lot of these same things, and so I'm really excited to have met you and to see that there's other kind of fellow travelers. And Steve, to your point, when I think back, I sometimes wish I had done an anthropology degree instead of a business degree, and would love to do some of that kind of beyond just like a tourist thing of like going to live with a tribe or going to see what they're doing for like a day or something. So if anyone has thoughts or connections on how to do that in a more outside of an academic context, but in a more meaningful way than just a kind of short touristy thing, I would love to hear about connections on how to do that.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. A little bit like what you envision doing for yourself. And there's the Pachamama Alliance, and there's things like that. But I think that, yeah, lots of food for thought there. Kate.
Thank you so much, Mitch. My one word would be interdisciplinary. Yay! Yay doesn't count, but really, so often I've been told that we, sacrifice depth when we go with breadth, and I'm really just applaud your ability to go both deep and wide.
That's great. Richard.
Fascinated is my word. I was just jumping up and down inside, listening to you doing your presentation, and I'm sure I'll be following your work from here on out.
That's great. Yeah, these deep dives are so great. Marilyn, I think that you complete our group here.
I already gave my word. Peace. Peace to all.
Peace, you did give your word. It was so short that I lost over it.
I mean, sorry, Kathleen hasn't gone, I believe.
Kathleen, you, yes, my dear.
In the best sense of the word, my one word is animated.
Okay, that's great. All right, so all good. So that completes ourselves, and then I might stay on if you have just a few more minutes, Mitch and Beth. We can just do a little bit of a wrap up, and then we'll say goodbye to the others until the next time.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.